College Football Nerds here talking Florida State and Georgia, talking Orange Bowl, and this is a big one. Even if there is some disappointment surrounding this game for both teams, it is worth talking about because it is super interesting. I got Josh here with me. We're going to get nerdy with y'all. We're going to talk models, statistics, personnel, matchups. We're going to get into all of it, even X's and O's. I know, nerds. We just talk about numbers and watch box scores, right, Josh? Okay, so I want to start. We're going to talk about opt-outs and all of that in a second. But I do want to start with numbers because this is kind of weird for me. We were just looking at this. Georgia's a 14-point favorite, which I think has been about that since the line opened, even with all of Florida State's opt-outs. They're about a 14-point favorite. The over-under is 44.5, which means Vegas thinks Florida State's going to score something. They got to score if those two things are true.
It is interesting to me, and something we've talked about a lot, right? In the last couple games, Florida State did not move the ball well. They did score some, obviously, on Florida, who's not a great defense. And then I think the consensus from a lot of people is the offense wasn't very effective. Statistically, it's just a fact that if you took the last two games of the season, you averaged it out as a whole season, they'd be 133 out of 133 teams offensively. Not really fair because so many teams play so many bad offenses or defenses. It's hard to be anything close to average and look respectable. But here, Vegas clearly doesn't think that assumption that everybody made when the playoff was seeded, when you talk about the quarterback being injured, is 100% true because they do think Florida State can score in Georgia. The assumption is that Georgia is a very good defense. Maybe they're not what they were 21-22. But those were generational defenses. They're merely normal year elite this year. And I do think Florida State's defense was elite, maybe even elite plus. We'll get into that. Opt-outs kind of color that to an extreme degree. But I do think it's fascinating that Florida State is a 14.5-point dog with a spread that says the game's going to be something like 15-31, the over-under being 44.5. So just as a starting point, people say it's a big number, but in many ways, Vegas is actually giving Florida State more of a puncher's chance than I think people appreciate.
When talking about matchups in this game and why the line maybe hasn't moved as much as it maybe people think that it would with opt-outs coming along, there's only one, and it's a big one, but only one defensive opt-out announced for Florida State so far. The only reason Florida State won the last two games of the year was because of how well that defense played. And look, you're without one of the most dynamic, pass rushers in the country, but you still have a good foundational defense. The offense, it's kind of interesting because the guys that are opting out, they're offensive players, and that offense wasn't considered a huge strength anyway, limited by quarterback. So, and look, I don't want to downplay what is going to be some NFL talent that's not going to play for Florida State in this game. But in a lot of ways, the selling feature for Florida State is that defense. So in a lot of ways, we're going to see a large portion of what we would have gotten with a fully intact Florida State, at least in terms of how they're going to compete in this game or the path through which they might find a win.
Yeah, and let me say right now from this game and everybody, all others, and maybe if you see us make a mistake, comment on it. We looked extensively for good lists of opt-outs, and in what we found, I could not find a single list that was remotely accurate to a whole game. Immediately, every list I saw had major errors, every single one where they were doing opt-out tracking. But to your points, guys like Johnny Wilson, Benson, those guys made up a lot of what that Florida State offense is. And you take Keon Coleman off the board, who was kind of the trump card for them in many occasions, and it gets hard to see how this Florida State game is going to turn out in a situation where they have much offensive production, where they're going to score a lot of points. I think it says a lot about maybe some faith in their depth that people didn't anticipate. But it is, let me say, ultimately, before we kind of jump quickly to talking about the game and modeling to the extent we can, given the situation, it does say that, maybe everybody overreacted a little bit to the depth issues, but at the same token, it may also mean that we don't really know who the teams are. But it is a shame that we don't get the game that we should have gotten because I do think Florida State would have presented a really challenging matchup, and we'll probably see that with some of the stuff we talk about, and we'll talk about why that's true. If they had their entire football team and they were truly healthy, I think they could have been competitive in this game. And I think had they been competitive in that way, it could have been a major statement for Florida State of being left out. And I think they would have had a legitimate claim, more so to me than anybody in recent memory, to say, hey, this wasn't just. We really should have been considered as a national champion. If they'd gone through and beaten Georgia, they could say we were absolutely every bit as good as Alabama and we were more deserving. Maybe they beat Georgia anyway. Maybe they still make that argument. But without the real game we should have gotten, it's just, frankly, to me as a college football fan, it's so disappointing and a dud. I'm disappointed tremendously for Florida State. Admittedly, we've made comments that both of us feel like the committee made the right decision. But it's the right decision relative to you've got to leave somebody out that was deserving in my mind. But as I say, there's one of three things failed, right? Or one of three things, if you want to. Three things screwed over Florida State. Was it Alabama? Was it the committee? Was it the system? I would say more than anything, it was the system. But we're never going to really know the extent of it because of the nature of the football game. And that's going to be my last word on it. We've said enough otherwise, and I'd really rather just focus on football for this game in particular.
Yeah, and I think that to your point, like if we got the full Florida State team minus quarterback and they beat Georgia, then they have a legitimate claim, because if Alabama goes on to win a national championship, the thing that got them there was beating Georgia. And the thing that everybody kept Florida State out for was they didn't think that they would be competitive against Georgia without Travis. So what's interesting is on the other side of the ball, we've got Georgia, and they haven't announced any opt-outs. No serious person thinks Bowers is going to play in this game, and he shouldn't if he's even remotely hurt. He's got enough tape out there. He's a probably top 5 pick. Depends on who needs a tight end, but he's up there. Money's made. It's in the bank. So I don't expect him to play. I am interested to see, there's one side of the ball that's I don't think is going to be very effective, and that's Florida State's offense versus what is not as good as has been Georgia defense, but is still a top 5 defense in the country. I don't think there's going to be a lot of production there. But I do think that we can glean a little bit about how effective Georgia's offense is or would have been in a full, matchup when we see them go against this very good Florida State defense. Talk about that a little bit and maybe get into the model.
Yeah, and this is where I thought the model would be sort of helpful. So our model doesn't know that this is Florida Stateless Travis. It doesn't know Florida Stateless Travis, Travisless Florida State. Doesn't know that Coleman's opted out. Doesn't know Wilson's opted out, etc. And it's based on the whole year evenly. People can critique that all they want. Look, guys, the truth of the matter is there's not enough games for us to cherry pick. If we do cherry pick, just like week 3 and 4, when we first released the model, it has wacky results. You would get really wacky results, which would make it almost useless on its own. And, guys that are hurt, sometimes they come back. Sometimes the guy to replace the injured player starts playing better once he gets a few games under his belt. There's no good way to deal with it. There's just not. This is a sport where we think numbers can be helpful, but our channel has always stood for the fact that you should be using the numbers intelligently. And this model is an example of that, right? Based on this season in its totality, it sees Georgia as 25.4, Florida State 19.9, so basically a 5.5-point favorite for Georgia. The yard per play differential, 5.8 yards per play for Georgia, 4.8 for Florida State. What I think is interesting across the board is none of these offensive numbers are very good at all. 7.2 yards per play for Georgia is below what we call competent, which is 7.5. Florida State at 6.2, though, is quite bad. And again, this is still mostly viewing Florida State as a Jordan Travis team. It still doesn't think Florida State would have moved the ball. Rushing, 4.2 yards per carry for Georgia is respectable. 3.5 for Florida State is not. Generally about 4 yards per carry is the point at which you're moving the ball relatively well. And so this is, on paper, kind of a slugfest, right? I mean, Georgia is not expected to move the ball all that well at all. They're expected to struggle. This is expected to be a game where Georgia can't really put up 30 points readily. The problem in our model's view is that Florida State, even with a healthier team and without opt-outs, was not expected to score over 20 points. And I think the interesting positive here, and the thing that can make this game a lot more interesting, to your point, the only major defensive player that I'm aware of that's opted out, and look, one, I'm probably wrong, and two, will probably be wrong by the time this airs, is Verse. And I think Verse is easily one of the best players in the country. Totally took over the Louisville game to a degree that really kind of made me question when I went back and watched it. Should Florida State have been in just because he was so good? Could that defense have held anybody to low yardage? I'm not sure if that was true, if that was just Louisville, whose offensive line's been weird all year. It doesn't matter at this point. But I think Florida State's defense is really on a national stage remarkably underrated. In our metrics, 5th versus the pass, 33 versus the run. Georgia 7th versus the pass, 29th versus the run. Every bit as good statistically as Georgia defensively. And again, Georgia's pass rushers, some of them like Jones have actually transferred or opted out. The depth on both of these teams has taken a huge hit, which can be really weird in how it affects them. But I think there's this underrated point here where Georgia, has a big edge because it's not clear how Florida State's going to move the ball or score, and nobody really knows what a team full of backups can do. I watched a team full of backups for Florida get run out of a building by Oklahoma a few years ago. But there's really not a guarantee that Georgia's going to score a lot. So this game could be a lot more competitive, a lot more interesting than I think people are giving it credit for. And that would be due to the fact that Georgia, when they've faced better defenses, especially better secondaries and better pass defenses, like Auburn and Alabama, have kind of struggled off and on this year.
Yeah, I think that this is an opportunity to, if you're a Georgia fan, to see how you can make adjustments to play a good defense and be effective, because Georgia's schedule wasn't great this year, and the two non-Alabama teams that were on their schedule that are highly ranked, Missouri and Ole Miss, both have good, not great defenses. They're not super talented, not super athletic. They're good defenses. They're not amazing. So you hit these break points and these stall points within these defenses where they might be okay against a Tulane or other mid-level SEC teams. When they face a Georgia, a lot of the things they're good at kind of falls apart. But even against Missouri, Georgia's offense wasn't great. They scored 30 points, but I think one of those scores was almost a pick six, like a really short field or something like that. Beck was 7.9 yards per attempt. Edwards was the highest rusher, 77 yards. It was a weird game. It was a short game, but the only defense they faced remotely as good as Florida State is Alabama, and they scored 24 points. So Georgia wants to come into this game and prove to themselves that offensively they have the pieces to compete against the best defenses, and I don't know that they've shown that so far this year. Josh, I'm going to have you pick first in this one because I'm still thinking.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Pick a game where we don't even really know what one of the teams is going to look like. Always easy.
Yeah, that's why I picked this one for you.
Yeah, appreciate it. I do think there's going to be some struggles for Georgia, but I think ultimately two things are going to happen. One, I think Georgia is going to get some points cheaply. I think due to all the offensive issues at Florida State, at some point that comes back to roost in, you don't have Keon Coleman on special teams, and so somebody makes a special teams mistake. Your backup quarterback throws a stupid interception. Your receiver tips the ball up, or you just don't move the ball and you go up short fields. I think Georgia hits 30 points. I have this game 31-14. And for Florida State side, I think the backup quarterback is going to be a little bit more effective than people anticipate. But I think the points are going to come late. I could see this being a game that is 31-3, 31-7 in the fourth quarter, and Georgia is not going to try to run up the score. And I have never really seen Smart do that. And they're going to almost certainly use this bowl game as a way to prep a lot of their young players they want to develop in the future. And I think Florida State may move the ball some in the fourth quarter when that happens, get a touchdown or two. And frankly, I think that's why the Vegas line is what it is, if I'm being honest. I think I'm going to say 31-14, but I frankly don't think the game is going to be quite that competitive. But I also don't think watching it's going to feel like the total bloodbath maybe some people unrealistically expect. Because Florida State's defense is very, very good, and they are going to mostly play in this game. They're probably going to be very motivated. They're one of the few teams to hold LSU under 30 points, right? And there was a reason for that. They took over the game defensively at the line of scrimmage. And especially with Georgia never being completely healthy, it felt like an offensive line this year. I think that's going to come into play. So we had a remarkably good track record picking Georgia games this year. And I think that's built us a little bit of credibility. And I'll say in this one, I think Georgia's going to have some struggles, but I think it's going to also reflect the reality on the Florida State side, which is, this is a competitive team, probably been a team that could have played well in the playoffs. And then the argument's always going to be, well, with the other starters, would they have been better offensively, or were they just, the moment they lost Travis, were they dead? Because I think the offensive version we're going to get from Florida State is going to be pretty well totally anemic. And even though it's an ugly game, I think it's going to make it feel like a foregone conclusion.
I don't think Florida State gets in the end zone in this game. I got 27-9. I think they will have put some drives together, put some points together, but I don't think they get into the end zone. I don't think it's just Travis. I mean, you have Bell is even opted out. Like that offense is just. It's hard.
It's gutted
to prep backups.
I mean, it's just gutted.
It is. It's hard to prep backups to be starters, to play cohesive as a starting unit in a month with a new quarterback against Georgia. And Georgia hasn't announced any opt-outs yet, and that's going to change. But yeah, I've got 27-9. Give me a parting shot on this one, and we'll wrap it up.
My parting shot on this one is it's going to be kind of interesting, I think, to see what the opt-out situation is close to game. Because Georgia hasn't announced opt-outs, it's not going to shock me because we've seen it the past few years. If we get to game time, and we might see a bunch of opt-outs from Georgia that we weren't necessarily expecting at the last minute. Just because they weren't announced doesn't mean they're necessarily not coming. They just weren't being publicized. So, if that happens and Georgia's defense has got opt-outs all over the place, look, it's better to be consistent on defense than talented, okay? And if you end up in a situation, again, like Florida did a few years ago versus Oklahoma, where you have a bunch of backups in defensively, it doesn't matter if they're talented or not. If they don't know what they're doing, a secondary player covering the wrong guy really well, it gives up a touchdown. And so this game could kind of swing really wildly in that situation. But, man, as somebody that doesn't really want to see playoff expansion, this is the game to me that is the number one, number two, and number three reason for it, which is I just hate that I'm not getting the real version of this game as we would have seen 5 or 10 years ago. And so I'll watch it because I love the sport, but I'm looking forward to an expanded playoff where these games actually happen in a meaningful way and we get to really see these teams play other teams in other conferences.
Yeah, opt-out season, what it has done has eliminated any sort of conference comparison, context. You get so little closure at the end of the season other than the teams that play in the playoffs. It's so frustrating because I want closure. I want to be able to prove that I was right or ignore if I was wrong about which conferences were better and which teams were better. But this gives us nothing. All right, y'all. Thanks for watching this long. If you're still here, remember, like, subscribe, collegefootballnerds.com. Check it out. Let us know in the comments who you think is going to win this game. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great holiday season, and God bless.